Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere you might not have on your list of places to get cozy. Imagine this, you're standing in the highlands of medieval Scotland. The mist so thick it feels like you could scoop it into a mug and drink it, though I wouldn't recommend it unless you enjoy the taste of soggy moss. Somewhere in the distance, a stag steps out from behind a gnarled old pine, its breath steaming in the cold air, and it watches you like it knows something you don't. Which, to be fair, it probably does. The ground under your boots is a patchwork of wet heather and rock, and the wind carries whispers that might be just the wind, or the echo of something older. Honestly, you wouldn't last 5 minutes out here without a wool cloak and about 6 layers of stubbornness. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I love knowing who's out there with me in the dark. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders as you start forward, your steps squelching in the wet peat. This is not a landscape that welcomes you, it tests you. The mist moves like it has intentions, curling around your ankles and drifting across the crags above. Somewhere up there, a raven croaks, the sound stretched and hollow, as if the hills themselves are speaking in their sleep. The highlands in this age are untamed in a way that's hard to grasp now. Every rise in the land hides something. A circle of ancient stones, a shepherd with more sheep than sense, or, if you're unlucky, a handful of men who think stranger is just another word for target. The wind tastes of stone dust and salt from the far-off sea, a reminder that even when you're miles inland, Scotland is never far from its own coasts. You pass a stream, its water so clear it looks like liquid glass, but colder than anything you'd willingly put your hand in. The rocks beneath it are worn smooth, carved by centuries of relentless flow. Locals here tell you not to drink without asking the stream's permission, not because the water will harm you, but because the spirit in it might hold a grudge. You can't tell if they're joking. That's the thing about Highlanders. Their humor lives right on the knife edge between truth and trickery. The hills around you aren't just hills, they're monuments. Long before the kingdom was a kingdom, people shaped this land. Some of the standing stones you pass have been here for thousands of years, silent witnesses to every war, treaty, and sheep theft in between. Nobody remembers exactly why they were placed where they are. Some say they're burial markers, others think they're calendars, and some will tell you in a hushed voice that they're gates, though they never quite finish the sentence about where they lead. As you climb a ridge, your legs aching, you catch sight of the first village you've seen in hours. Smoke curls from turf-roofed huts, and the smell of peat fires drifts toward you. The buildings look like they've grown out of the ground, their walls thick against the cold, their doors low enough you have to duck to enter. You're met with wary eyes. People here don't take strangers at face value, but offer a respectful nod and maybe a small gift, and you might be invited inside. Inside, the warmth is almost dizzying after the chill outside. A pot of something thick and unidentifiable simmers over the hearth. You're offered a wooden cup of ale, its foam spilling over your fingers, and you pretend not to notice the faint grit at the bottom. Conversation here is sparse. People speak when they have something worth saying, and silence isn't awkward, it's just another kind of company. It's in places like this that you start to understand. Medieval Scotland isn't built for comfort. It's built for survival. Every stone wall, every twist in the path, every unspoken rule is part of a larger rhythm, one you're only just beginning to hear. And if you listen closely enough, through the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind outside, you might catch a fragment of it. The pulse of a kingdom still shaping itself, beat by beat, in the shadow of the mountains. By the time you step back out into the night, the mist has swallowed the village whole, as if your visit was just a brief pause in its endless breathing. The moon is hiding somewhere above the clouds, and the only light comes from the dull red embers of a dying hearth behind you. The air is sharp enough to sting your lungs, but it carries with it that damp, earthy scent that seems older than the hills themselves. Somewhere in the darkness, a sheep bleats once, short, almost startled, before falling silent again. You find yourself wondering whether it saw something you didn't. The land here is more than just rugged. It's layered. Beneath your boots, beneath the roots and stones, are the bones of a people who were here long before Scotland had borders. People who didn't just survive here, they thrived. Their monuments are scattered across the landscape like breadcrumbs left for the future, though most who pass them now barely glance twice. A flat slab of rock half buried in the heather? To the untrained eye, it's nothing, but to someone who knows, it's a doorway to the Stone Age. You wander toward one such site, 3 standing stones, taller than a man, weathered and lichen-streaked. They lean slightly inward, like conspirators sharing a secret too ancient for words. Archaeologists will tell you these stones might have aligned with the sun or moon in some way, but the locals are more likely to shrug and say, they've always been there. And then they'll tell you not to linger after dark, because things move between the stones when no one's looking. No one ever specifies what things means. It's somehow more unnerving that way. A cold gust rolls down from the ridge, making the grass hiss in waves. The world feels suddenly vast, and you feel very small in it. A dot in a tapestry woven by time and weather and countless footsteps before yours. You crouch and run your fingers over the rough surface of one of the stones. It's colder than the air, even after centuries of wind and rain. You picture the people who dragged it here using ropes, levers, and sheer stubbornness without iron tools or wheels. They built with what they had: muscle, will, and the belief that these stones mattered enough to be worth the effort. That belief lingers. Even now, festivals sometimes take place near these circles, though they're less about ancient gods and more about modern curiosity. But there's always that edge of reverence, that sense you're walking on ground that remembers. And if you happen to camp nearby, well, let's just say you'll hear sounds you can't quite explain. A footstep when no one's there. A low hum that seems to come from inside your own skull. Historians still argue over whether these are remnants of ritual sites or just the human mind playing tricks in the dark. You're not sure which explanation would be more unsettling. As you turn to leave, you glance over your shoulder. The stones are still there, silent and unmoving, but somehow you can't shake the feeling that they're watching you leave. Not in a threatening way, more like they're marking your presence, filing it away with all the others who've passed through. You pull your cloak tighter, the memory of that cold stone still clinging to your fingertips, and head back into the rolling mist, carrying with you the quiet weight of something that refuses to be forgotten. The mist parts just enough for you to see shapes moving along the ridge, too fluid to be rock, too deliberate to be the wind. At first you think it's a group of hunters, but then the moon slips out from behind a cloud, and you catch the faint shimmer of paint on skin. Blue spirals, jagged lines, shapes that look almost alive in the moonlight. You've found yourself in the land of the Picts, or rather, they've found you. They don't announce themselves the way you might expect. No shouting, no threatening gestures, just the soft crunch of bare feet on damp earth as they circle in closer. You've heard about them, of course. Everyone has. The Romans called them Picti, the painted people, and claimed they were as fierce as the storms that rake these hills. But face to face, they're not the one-dimensional savages the chroniclers like to describe. Their eyes are sharp, assessing you like a puzzle, and their movements are quick without being frantic, like deer deciding whether you're a threat. One of them steps forward, his skin patterned with swirling blue bands that twist around muscle and bone. The pigment is woad, ground from plants and mixed into a paste that stains the skin for days. It's cold, biting stuff applied not just for intimidation in battle, but for ceremony, for identity. In a world without written language, these markings speak for them. Each swirl and knot means something: lineage, allegiance, maybe even the number of enemies you've sent to the afterlife. Historians still debate the details. Some think the designs were purely war paint. Others insist they were worn every day. Either way, you can't deny they make an impression. They lead you wordlessly, but with enough subtle gestures that you understand, to a clearing ringed with stones. A fire smolders low in the center, throwing flickers of light that catch on the painted patterns. The Picts are not a people of excess. Everything here has a purpose. The spears leaning against a fallen log are honed to needle points. The leather cloaks are stitched from hides weatherproofed with animal fat. You notice the way they place themselves, never fully turning their backs, always keeping a line of sight on you and one another. Trust is earned here, not assumed. As the fire grows, so does the sound. A drumbeat, steady and low, begins somewhere beyond your sight. Then a voice joins in, not singing exactly, but chanting, the rise and fall of the notes echoing off the stones. It's a sound that feels older than language itself, like the land humming through human throats. You don't understand the words, but you understand the intent. This is about belonging, about reminding each other who they are in a world where outsiders are always trying to define them. Someone hands you a carved wooden cup, filled with a liquid that smells like both honey and smoke. You take a cautious sip. It's sweet at first, then sharp, burning a trail down your throat. You're not entirely sure if it's meant to warm you or test your resolve. Probably both. The Picts watch you drink, their faces unreadable in the firelight. There's a story they pass down, one you hear in fragments tonight, broken by laughter and gestures, about how their ancestors fought not just men, but the land itself. How they learned to read the sky like a map, how they could track a deer for days without leaving a footprint, and how, when the Romans tried to tame this place, it was the Picts who vanished into the mists, only to strike from nowhere, disappearing again before the legionaries could even draw breath. By the time the fire dies to embers, the blue-painted figures have begun to fade back into the darkness. No farewells, no handshakes. Just a slow return to the land they came from, as if they were never there. When you finally turn to go, you glance behind you. The clearing is empty, silent, and you could almost convince yourself you imagined it all, if not for the faint smear of blue woad still on your palm. By the next morning, the air feels heavier, as if the hills themselves are bracing for something. You follow a narrow track that winds down from the high ground, and for the first time in days, the landscape begins to open out. Ahead, you spot a straight line cutting across the rolling terrain, unnatural, stubborn, and utterly unlike the meandering paths the locals take. That's your first clue the Romans have been here. To the people who call this place home, the Roman Empire is less a name and more a rumor from the south, carried on the lips of traders and travelers. But to those who've actually seen the legions march, it's a spectacle you don't forget. Rows of soldiers in segmented armor, shields gleaming even under Scotland's stingy sun, and the relentless clink-clink of iron nails in their boots. They move like a machine, every man in step, every spear angled just so. The Picts might melt into the mist, but the Romans cut through it. You walk along the edge of a ditch, its walls still steep after centuries. This is no ordinary trench. It's the remains of one of their northern outposts. You can almost hear the echoes of Latin commands, the hammering of nails into timber palisades, the dull thud of stone foundations being laid. The Romans came here with an empire's certainty that stone walls and military discipline could tame any frontier. What they didn't fully grasp, at least at first, was that this land has no interest in being tamed. They built forts like beads on a necklace, strung along the edge of their world. Inside, life was surprisingly ordered. grain stores carefully measured, bathhouses kept warm with underfloor heating, officers eating imported figs while the wind howled outside. From here, they launched forays deeper into the highlands, brief, sharp pushes meant to intimidate or pacify. Sometimes they came back with captives, sometimes with nothing but frostbite. The locals tell stories of watching from the hills as these disciplined ranks moved below. How the Romans' red cloaks made them easy to spot against the green and gray. How their roads cut through the land like scars. And how, no matter how many forts they built, the mists always closed in behind them, erasing their presence like chalk from a slate. You pause at a collapsed stone gateway, the remains of what might have been a grand entrance once. A carved eagle lies half-buried nearby, its wings chipped and weathered. The symbol of Rome, now reduced to a silent marker in a field. Some say the Picts took pride in toppling these emblems whenever they could, not just to win battles but to erase the idea that anyone could own this land. Historians still debate whether the Romans ever truly intended to conquer all of what we now call Scotland, or whether they simply wanted to make a point and then hold the line. What's certain is that even the most disciplined army in the world eventually learned the limits of its reach here. And as you stand on this windswept ridge, looking out toward the highlands, you realize that maybe this was never about land at all. It was about spirit. A spirit you can't march over, can't wall in, and definitely can't order into neat formation. Somewhere far off, a raven's cry carries on the wind, and you think about how many armies it must have watched come and go. You turn away from the ruins, leaving the stones to sink slowly back into the earth, and head north, toward a land the Romans never fully claimed, but could never quite forget. The land starts to funnel you southward, into gentler hills where the wind carries a different smell, less peat and salt, more damp grass and wood smoke. Then, without much warning, you see it. A long, low ribbon of stone cutting across the landscape, stretching so far in either direction it seems to melt into the horizon. You've reached Hadrian's Wall. To the Romans, this was more than just a wall, it was a statement. A this far, no further kind of statement, carved in stone and labor. It wasn't the northern edge of the empire in the maps they drew back in Rome, but it was where their ambitions began to fray. This wasn't just about keeping the northern tribes out. It was about reminding everyone, even the soldiers posted here, that beyond this line was the unknown. You place your palm against the wall. The stone is cool, rough, and slick with centuries of rain. Somewhere inside it, you can almost hear the ghost of hammers striking, of carts groaning under the weight of quarried rock. The wall wasn't built overnight. It took years, tens of thousands of men, and more patience than most generals possessed. The blocks fit together without mortar in places, each one shaped by hand. At night, this place takes on a stranger character. You've heard the stories from shepherds and night watchmen, of hearing voices in languages they don't recognize, of seeing torchlight where no one should be, of shadows pacing along the wall as if still on duty. Some laugh these off as tricks of the wind, but others, well, they don't laugh. They just say you shouldn't whistle when you walk beside the wall after dark. Standing here, you can almost picture a century ago, or rather many centuries ago, when the wall was lined with watchtowers. Fires burned in braziers, illuminating the crests of helmets. Patrols moved along the ramparts in the rain, their boots splashing through puddles that formed faster than the drains could clear them. Beyond the wall lay the land of the Picts, the raids, and the endless heather. Behind it lay the orderly forts, the barracks, the market stalls, and the small, stubborn comforts of Roman life. But even with the wall, the frontier was never truly quiet. The reavers of later centuries hadn't been born yet, but the spirit of the borderlands was already here. A restless, shifting mix of trade, theft, and uneasy truces. Sometimes deals were made at the gates. Wool for wine, cattle for weapons. Sometimes those meetings ended in blood. The wall might have been solid stone, but the people on both sides still found ways to cross it. Historians still debate whether Hadrian's Wall was primarily defensive, symbolic, or just a way to keep restless soldiers busy. Whatever the truth, it changed the way people thought about the land. It wasn't just wilderness anymore. It was a line in the mind as much as on the ground. And lines like that tend to linger long after the stones have started to crumble. You walk along its length for a while, the mist clinging low to the grass. Sheep graze at its base as if it's nothing more than an inconvenient ridge, and a bird of prey wheels overhead, its cry echoing down the valley. Eventually, the wall dips and disappears into a copse of trees, swallowed by shadow. You follow it for a few more paces before deciding you'd rather not be here after sunset. Not because you believe the stories, of course, but, well, you don't not believe them either. The wind has been shifting for hours, carrying a briny tang you haven't smelled since the coast. By the time you crest the final rise, the gray expanse of the sea spreads out before you, restless and churning. At first, the horizon is empty. Then, like ink stains blooming on parchment, dark shapes emerge. Triangular sails, square-cut and striped. The Norse have come. They don't arrive quietly. The longships slice through the water with a kind of arrogant grace, their carved prows rising and falling in the swells. Each ship is a floating contradiction, slender enough to slip into shallow inlets, but solid enough to survive a storm that would tear other vessels apart. The dragons and serpents carved into the prows aren't just decoration. They're meant to unsettle anyone watching from shore. And judging by the tightening in your chest, they're doing their job. You pick your way down toward the strand, the sand damp and packed under your boots. The first ship slides up onto the beach without a pause, its keel grating against the stones. The crew leaps out in unison, their shields slung across their backs, axes at their hips. They're not wearing the heavy mail of the Romans, nor the painted spirals of the Picts, just layered wool, leather, and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing the sea is your true home. The locals have a complicated relationship with these men from the north. Yes, they raid, burning settlements, stealing cattle, and sometimes taking people with them. But they also trade salt fish, amber, fine weaves of cloth, and weapons of quality you can't find anywhere else. A chieftain here might curse the Norse one season and feast with them the next, depending on the wind and the tides. Someone once told you the Norse navigate without maps, reading the shape of the waves, the flight of seabirds, even the smell of the air. Watching them pull their ships onto the beach with practiced ease, you believe it. Their voices roll across the shore in a language that sounds like thunder breaking apart. One man laughs so loudly it startles the gulls into flight. Another squats by the water, scooping it up to splash his face as if greeting an old friend. That night, you find yourself at the edge of a camp lit by driftwood fires. The Norse sit in a loose circle, passing horns of mead and tearing into roasted fish. A storyteller holds the group's attention, his hands carving shapes in the air as he spins a saga of ice fields wider than kingdoms, of battles fought in snowstorms, of voyages so far west they found a shore no one in Scotland has ever seen. The younger men listen with rapt attention, but you notice the older ones smiling with a kind of weary fondness. They've seen enough seas to know a good story deserves embellishment. Historians still debate how much Norse blood flows in the veins of modern Scots, but here on the sand, under the smell of salt and smoke, the question feels beside the point. Cultures meet in more ways than war. They braid together in language, in marriages, in shared songs that outlast the men who sing them. And in this moment, with the tide pulling out and the ships rocking gently in the shallows, you realize the Norse have left more than footprints on these shores. They've left currents, subtle, invisible, and still shaping the coastlines today. As the fire dies low, you catch sight of a ship rocking at anchor, its dragon prow aimed straight at the dark horizon. Somewhere beyond that line of black water lies home for these men. But here, on this damp strand, they've left a part of themselves and taken a piece of Scotland in return. You turn away, the wind tugging at your cloak, and wonder what other sails might appear on the horizon before this story is done. By the time you leave the coast behind, the air has changed again. No longer sharp with salt, but heavy with the smell of rain-soaked earth and wood smoke. The path winds inland, climbing through low hills where the wind hushes itself, as if even it knows to tread softly here. You follow a narrow stream that snakes between mossy boulders, and soon you see it. A low cluster of stone buildings huddled together like sheep in a storm. The monastery. At first glance, it doesn't look like much. The walls are plain, the roof steep and shingled with slate, and the whole place seems almost too quiet. But step inside and you enter another world. The smell of damp wool and ink hangs in the air, mixed with the faint tang of tallow candles. Somewhere down the hall, a quill scratches steadily against parchment. The sound is oddly soothing, like rain tapping on a window you're too warm to care about. The monks move like shadows, their woolen habits brushing against the flagstone floors. They speak rarely and softly, as if the air here might shatter if they raise their voices too high. But when they sit down at their desks, they work with a patience that would make a saint restless. Copying scripture, recording the history of kings, and sometimes slipping in small notes about storms, harvests, and strange omens in the sky. Those last details are often written in the margins, like secrets they can't help but share with whoever might read their work centuries later. You pass one scriptorium table and pause. A single page lies half-finished. Intricate letters curl into existence under a monk's hand, the ink still wet and shining. At the edges of the page, delicate patterns twist and coil, interlaced knots, small animals, even faces peeking out from the tangles. It's the kind of art that doesn't just decorate a story, it becomes part of the story itself. The monk doesn't look up at you, but his lips twitch in a faint smile, as though he knows you've noticed the mischief hiding in his holy work. Life here is built around the rhythm of prayer and labor. The bells toll at dawn, midday, and night, and the monks file into the chapel like water flowing into a basin. The singing is plain and slow, but in this stone chamber, the notes swell and linger long after the last voice has stopped. You feel it in your ribs, in the soles of your feet, a reminder that devotion here is as much about endurance as inspiration. Historians still debate how much of Scotland's early history survived because of communities like this. Without them, the invasions, the plagues, the endless clan feuds might have left nothing but oral tales, worn thinner with each telling. But the monks, tucked away in their wind-bitten sanctuaries, preserved words like they were gold. Sometimes literally, gold leaf, pounded so thin it could float on a breath, pressed into holy names and borders of illuminated pages. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters, and you think about how many winters have passed over these walls, how many storms they've heard while bent over their desks, refusing to stop even when the ink froze in its pot. You picture one of those books, centuries later, resting in a museum case under sterile light, and you wonder if the monk who wrote it would find that amusing or tragic. As you leave, the bell rings again, its tone rolling out across the hills. The sound follows you long after the monastery is out of sight, mingling with the steady murmur of the stream. It feels less like you've left a place, and more like the place has followed you, its quiet persistence stitched into the fabric of your journey. The hills grow steeper now, ridged like the spine of some great sleeping beast. Heather brushes at your boots, and the wind is back, no longer gentle but sharp, as though it wants to remind you whose land you walk. Somewhere above, a raven calls, its voice echoing in the folds of the valley. The sound is neither welcome nor warning. It is simply there, like the sky. You're deep in clan country now, where family names carry more weight than titles, and a promise made over a fire can bind tighter than iron. The people here do not speak much to strangers, but their eyes miss nothing. The moment you step into the first cluster of houses, you can feel the weight of that gaze. Measured, cautious, not yet hostile but certainly not warm. Clan life is a web of loyalty and blood, both in the literal and the less comfortable sense. Feuds can smolder for generations, sparked by cattle raids, insults, or a boundary stone nudged an arm's length too far. Yet the same people who will fight a neighbor for a scrap of pasture will march shoulder to shoulder against anyone foolish enough to threaten their glen. The hearth is the heart of every home here. At night, families gather close, passing stories down the line as though feeding the fire itself. The tales are full of kings betrayed, warriors lost in the mist, and oaths sworn so deeply that even the dead are bound by them. You realize that in a land where winters can last longer than hope, stories are not just entertainment. They are a form of survival, a way to keep memory warm. Blood oaths are not taken lightly. You've heard whispers of them in the lowlands, but here you begin to understand. Two men will clasp forearms over a dagger, a drop of blood from each running together. Words are spoken, not loudly but with the kind of quiet that feels dangerous. These oaths are meant to last until death, and sometimes beyond, if the stories are to be believed. Breaking one does not simply shame a person. It curses them. There are clan banners, too worn, hand-stitched, smelling faintly of smoke. They're not flown for decoration, but for identity. In a battle, the sight of your own banner means you're not alone. The sight of another means you know exactly where to aim. Historians still wrestle with the truth of these feuds and alliances, because the records are patchwork at best. Much of what survives is filtered through outsiders, English chroniclers, church scribes, who often misunderstood or exaggerated for their own purposes. Yet in the glens, the oral histories have a different clarity. They may not match the written record, but they carry the weight of lived memory. And that, in its own way, is a kind of truth. As you leave the village, you catch sight of a young boy practicing with a wooden sword, his stance far too serious for his age. Behind him, an old man sits sharpening a real blade with slow, deliberate strokes. The sound of steel against stone follows you down the path, a reminder that here, peace is never assumed. It is negotiated, kept, and sometimes bought with blood. The road becomes less a road and more a stubborn thread of earth, winding upward into the ribs of the highlands. It's not the gentle rise of farmland hills anymore. This is the kind of climb that makes your calves ache and your breath taste of stone. Somewhere far below, the glens close in behind you, and the wind sharpens again, smelling faintly of pine resin and wet granite. Strongholds here were not built for beauty, though they sometimes achieve it by accident. They cling to crags, half-grown from the rock itself, as if the mountain decided to sprout a wall or a watchtower out of sheer defiance. They're not the sprawling castles of the lowlands with their manicured courtyards and symmetrical wings. These fortresses are cramped, hard-edged, and practical, designed to survive storms, sieges, and the kind of winters that can freeze a man in the saddle before he reaches the gate. You see one ahead now, its walls dark against the sky, the path zigzagging toward it like a stitched scar. The approach is deliberate. Every bend in the track is a blind corner, each offering a perfect place for an archer to send a warning shot, or something less polite. These defenses were not an afterthought. They were the only thought. Inside, the great hall is smaller than you'd expect. Its walls hung not with silk tapestries but with hides, weapons, and the occasional bit of loot from raids. Spanish coins, an English helmet, a carved piece of driftwood from somewhere far south. The air smells of smoke and wet wool, and the stone floor bears grooves from centuries of boots, claws, and the dragging of heavy things best left unmentioned. The laird's seat is raised only slightly above the rest, enough to signal authority without inviting envy. Feasting here is not the endless spectacle of royal banquets. The food is solid barley bread, smoked venison, root vegetables boiled until they surrender, and the ale is poured with a kind of grim efficiency. Guests eat quickly, because the cold creeps in even when the fires roar. But strongholds are not just homes. They are statements. A Highland keep says, "We are still here. We can hold this ground." And sometimes, when the lowlanders or the crown itself try to push their influence north, the stone replies on behalf of the people inside. From the ramparts, the view is vast, endless ridges marching away into the mist. You can see where the land folds in on itself, hiding entire glens from sight. Somewhere in those folds are other strongholds, invisible but present, each one keeping watch over its slice of the highlands. You realize something here. These fortresses are not meant to dominate the landscape. They are meant to belong to it. And in doing so, they become as much a part of the land's memory as the rivers and the ridgelines. Destroy one, and the stones will be reused. The memory will not. When you leave, the path down feels steeper than it should. The keep vanishes behind a curve in the rock, but you know it's still there, hunched against the wind, waiting for the next generation to take shelter behind. The mainland ends not with a neat, sandy farewell, but with a scatter of jagged edges, headlands, cliffs, and tidal inlets where the sea gnaws at the rock in slow, patient bites. Beyond that lie the isles, strung across the western horizon like a necklace carelessly dropped in the surf. You don't take a road to reach them, you take a boat, and not a grand, many-oared galley either. Here, the sea is not a friendly place to linger, so the vessels are long, narrow, and quick to answer their helms. The crossing is always a conversation with the wind, and the wind here has a habit of interrupting. One moment it sighs softly over the water, and the next it roars, throwing spindrift into your face until you taste salt and cold. The isles themselves are not all alike. Some are green and gentle, sheep-grazed and dotted with small whitewashed chapels. Others are bare bones of rock, where only seabirds and the hardiest people survive. And some, perhaps the most important, are crowned with their own strongholds, squat towers or sprawling stone halls that rise out of the cliff like something the sea forgot to swallow. Here, the lords of the isles rule a domain defined not by acres but by tides. They command fleets more than armies, and their banners fly best when there is salt spray in the air. Their authority is a patchwork of kinship, threat, and hospitality. One day a cousin from the mainland arrives to seal an alliance with a gift of whiskey and a promise. The next arrival's ship is set adrift after its crew is given just enough food to survive the return trip. The feasts in these halls are loud affairs, and unlike the Highland keeps, they embrace spectacle. Here, the food is often from the sea, cod roasted whole, mussels steamed in ale, kelp-wrapped salmon baked in pits of hot stones. The air is heavy with the smell of peat fires and wet wool, and you learn quickly that stories are as much a form of currency as silver. Power here is slippery, just like the sea itself. A lord may control an island for decades, only to lose it overnight to a storm, or to a cousin with a faster ship and better timing. Yet, despite the shifting fortunes, the sea roads bind the isles together. Each cove, each reef, each sheltered anchorage is known by name and by story, passed down through generations. From the cliff's edge, you watch the sun sink westward, turning the water to hammered gold. Far out, a single longship cuts across the horizon, its sail red in the dying light. You wonder where it's heading, toward a friendly harbor, or into a feud that will be remembered in song long after the salt has eaten the wood. And here, in this borderland between land and water, you feel it. The isles are not just places. They are promises and threats and lifelines. Lose the sea, and you lose the isles, and the sea becomes a stranger. The marches are not so much a line on a map as they are a mood, a constant low hum of tension, as if the land itself is holding its breath. You arrive here without quite meaning to, noticing first that the villages seem more tightly clustered, the fields more heavily hedged. Then come the fortified manor houses, squatting behind ditches and palisades like cats watching for movement. This is the frontier, the border between two kingdoms that have spent more years at war than at peace. Official treaties may proclaim where one realm ends and the other begins, but the actual ground is decided by whoever has the strongest grip that week. The people here do not waste time with illusions. They know that a neighbor today might be an enemy tomorrow. Cattle are locked up as carefully as gold, and every man, woman, and even the older children can recognize the smoke of a raid before it reaches the next hill. The lords of the marches are not quite like those of the heartland. They are warriors first, administrators second, and poets never. Their strongholds are built less for show than for survival. Thick-walled towers with arrow slits, spiral stairs designed so a right-handed attacker is at a disadvantage, and gates that can be barred in the blink of an eye. These are homes where weapons rest within arm's reach, even in the bedchamber. Feuds here are a kind of seasonal weather. Some are sparked by insult or ambition, others by nothing more than hunger in a bad year. Raiding is not just warfare, it's economy, politics, and sometimes entertainment. A well-timed cattle raid can cripple a rival's fortunes without a single pitched battle. But for all its violence, life in the marches has its own peculiar rhythm. Marriages are arranged to secure temporary peace, and the same families who clash on horseback might share a wedding feast in the next month. Though guests will still keep their knives close at hand, you can feel the tension in the very air. A blend of suspicion, defiance, and grim humor. People here measure trust not in years, but in seasons without betrayal. Standing on a rise at dusk, you can see the patchwork of fields and hamlets stretching toward the distant hills that mark the edge of the neighboring realm. Somewhere out there, a rider is making for a watchtower to report a sighting, and somewhere else, a lord is deciding whether tonight will be quiet, or remembered in song as the night the border changed by a mile. Here, the frontier is alive, always shifting, always testing, and whether you cross it by accident or intention, you will not leave it unchanged. The first thing you notice about a merchant city is not its walls, though they are there, tall, proud, and studded with towers. No, it is the noise. It rolls toward you like a tide before you've even stepped through the gates. The creak of wagon wheels, the slap of leather sandals on cobbles, the rise and fall of a dozen dialects arguing over the price of fish or the purity of silver. Here, gold speaks louder than banners. Titles and bloodlines mean little when a man with no noble crest can buy a ship, load it with wool, wine, or spices, and return with a fortune. The streets smell of saffron and salted cod, beeswax and tanned hides, a reminder that this city's heart beats to the rhythm of trade winds and caravan bells. The merchant princes who rule here are not warriors in the traditional sense. Their battlefields are counting houses and guild halls, and their weapons are ledgers and contracts. Yet make no mistake, these are dangerous men and women. A bad trade deal can ruin a rival faster than a siege, and a whispered rumor about a shipment's quality can sink a reputation overnight. Stone warehouses rise like fortresses along the docks, their doors barred with iron and guarded as fiercely as any castle gate. The quays are forests of masts, the air a tapestry of gull cries, curses in a dozen languages, and the ringing of shipwrights' hammers. Every object here, every sack of grain, bolt of cloth, and barrel of oil, is in motion, changing hands, accruing profit. Guilds rule much of the city's life. A cobbler cannot simply make shoes without the guild's blessing, nor a goldsmith craft a ring without paying the proper fees. The guilds protect their members fiercely, sometimes with knives in the dark, and they keep meticulous records, for memory here is written in ink, not sung in ballads. By night, the merchant houses glow with candlelight as deals are struck over goblets of sweet wine. These are not idle feasts but negotiations in disguise. Each toast a test, each compliment a careful probe. Alliances are forged and broken in the space of a dessert course. From the safety of the walls, you might think this city is unshakable. But prosperity is as fragile as glass. A single failed harvest in the hinterlands, a blockade at sea, or a plague ship in the harbor can turn bustle into panic almost overnight. And when fortunes falter, the city remembers its other voice, the one that shouts in the streets and breaks windows. For now, though the coins clink, the warehouses fill, and the harbor bristles with sails, the city thrives, each day measured not in prayers or victories, but in profit. The road is never truly quiet. Even when the sun sinks low and the shadows stretch long across the hills, you can still hear the soft rhythm of leather soles on packed earth, the clink of a staff striking a stone, the low murmur of prayers whispered in a dozen tongues. This is the pilgrim's road, worn smooth by generations of feet, each step taken not for trade or conquest, but for the salvation of a soul. You join the stream of travelers as it winds between fields and forests, the crowd shifting constantly like a living river. Some wear plain wool and carry nothing but a pouch of bread. Others are draped in bright cloaks and lead mules piled with gifts for shrines. At the front, a barefoot friar chants a psalm, his voice steady despite the dust and heat. Behind him, a weary knight limps along, armor rusting at the joints, the scallop shell of Santiago tied to his belt like a badge of honor. The pilgrimage roads are a world of their own, a long, narrow kingdom with no walls, no throne, and yet an unshakable hierarchy. The sick and poor shuffle to the edges of the path, making way for nobles and bishops. Beggars cluster at crossroads where the faithful might loosen their purses. Innkeepers lurk at the edges of villages, offering warm bread and a place by the fire for a price. Each day follows a slow ritual. Rise before dawn, walk until the mist burns off, pause to drink from a roadside spring or eat a crust of cheese. Walk again until the sun presses hot against your neck, then collapse into whatever shelter the next village can offer. At night, the roads belong to other pilgrims, those of the imagination. By the glow of the hearth, tales of miracles and curses are traded like coins. You hear of saints who appear to the lost in the dead of night, of relics that heal with a touch, of thieves who masquerade as holy men to rob the faithful as they sleep. The roads themselves are marked with symbols. The scallop shell guides you west, the painted cross points toward the next chapel, and small piles of stones left at forked paths whisper that someone else passed here before you. In some places, the track narrows to little more than a goat path over a ridge. In others, it widens to a causeway lined with markets where relics, some genuine, many not, are sold alongside charms, ribbons, and bottles of holy water. For many, the journey is penance. For others, it is a test of faith, a gamble with their own endurance. And for a few, it is a quest not for God but for something far more earthly. The adventure, the stories, and perhaps the quiet transformation that comes when you have walked for weeks under the same sky. By the time you glimpse the spire of a distant cathedral, your feet are blistered, your clothes stained with dust, and your heart, whether you know it or not, has already changed. The safety of the pilgrim road unravels long before you see the first stone wall. It begins with a subtle shift in the air, the quiet confidence of open farmland giving way to a taut, unspoken vigilance. Travelers walk closer together now, their eyes drawn to the ridgelines where dark shapes sometimes linger, just far enough to keep their intentions uncertain. This is the frontier, where kingdoms meet not with a handshake but with a stare held too long. The border between Castile and Aragon is not a line drawn on any map you carry. It is a living thing, breathing in the watchtowers and out in the lonely stretches where no one dares linger after dusk. The first fortress you see rises from a rocky hill like a clenched fist, its walls the color of storm clouds. Flags hang limp in the still air, their heraldry faded by wind and sun. You approach under the gaze of men in chainmail who lean on their spears with casual menace. The gate creaks open just wide enough to admit a cart, its driver muttering a greeting before hurrying through as though the very air might close in behind him. Inside, the courtyard smells of horses, smoke, and the iron tang of sharpened weapons. The men here speak little, but their eyes flick toward the horizon as if expecting a horn to sound at any moment. Merchants set up stalls against the wall, selling salted meat, hard bread, and water skins, supplies that keep you moving fast and light in case trouble rides in. Beyond the fortress lies a no-man's land of scrub and stone, where paths are worn but never trusted. In the distance, a rival stronghold sits on its own rise, its towers sharp and pale against the sky. Between the two, patrols pass each other without a word, hands on hilts, each side measuring the other. The tension is not always spoken, but it is always felt, like a taut rope that might snap at the wrong word, the wrong glance, the wrong sound in the dark. And yet, life goes on here. Farmers still tend their thin strips of land under the shadow of siege engines left to rust. Children chase each other through the dust, their games echoing off the walls. Minstrels still wander in, offering songs to distract from the knowledge that war can be called like a sudden storm. When night falls, the fortresses shut their gates with a finality you can feel in your bones. The lamps along the parapets flare to life, and shadows beyond the wall deepen into a black so complete you imagine entire armies could hide in it. Inside, you sleep lightly, knowing that here, the difference between a peaceful dawn and a blood-red sunrise might be measured in the time it takes for a torch to be lit. The road bends westward until the smell of salt reaches you before the sea itself. It clings to your clothes, your skin, your very breath, as if the ocean intends to claim you long before you set eyes upon it. When at last the coastline reveals itself, it is not a gentle sweep of sand but a jagged wall of stone, against which waves smash themselves to froth with a violence that feels almost personal. Here, on the edge of the known world, Castile and Aragon trade their land-bound rivalries for something far more restless: the control of the sea. Stone watchtowers jut from the cliffs like teeth, each flying banners that catch the wind in bold colors: scarlet and gold for Castile, deep crimson and yellow for Aragon. Between them, the harbors pulse with a different kind of life, one that smells of tarred ropes, drying fish, and the acrid bite of pitch on ship hulls. The docks are never still. Sailors, bronze-skinned, salt-crusted, their eyes narrowed from a lifetime of scanning horizons, heave crates onto carts, argue over coin, or squat on barrels to mend nets. Their language is a stew of Castilian, Catalan, Basque, and the scattered syllables of traders from Italy, North Africa, and beyond. You can tell the difference between a fisherman and a privateer by the way they look at you. One measures you for your coin, the other for your usefulness in a fight. For here, the sea is not just a route, it is a battlefield. Galleys with painted prows and rows of oars bob in the water like predators resting between hunts. At night, when the tide comes in and the moon turns the waves to molten silver, you hear the distant creak of timbers and the occasional muffled shout from beyond the headland, signs that somewhere, just out of sight, two ships are circling each other in the dark. The locals speak of the sea lords, captains who answer only to their own ambition, yet swear fealty to whichever crown offers the most gold. Some fly Castile's cross, others Aragon's crest, and some none at all. Their ships vanish into storms only to reappear weeks later, heavy with spoils and darker with secrets. Tales drift ashore of raids on rival ports, of midnight boardings, of merchant vessels whose lanterns were last seen flickering before being swallowed by the horizon. Yet the sea is also a giver. It brings spices from the Levant, silks from the Far East, and the sweet tang of oranges from North Africa. The markets by the water are a chaos of color and scent. Crimson pomegranates piled beside jars of pickled olives, bolts of dyed cloth unfurling in the wind, and street cooks ladling steaming fish stew into wooden bowls for anyone with a coin. Still, no one lingers too close to the edge after sunset. The water looks different in the dark, more alive, more hungry. Old fishermen will tell you, in voices lowered against the wind, that the sea remembers every ship it has claimed and waits for more. Whether you believe them or not, you cannot help but glance over your shoulder as you leave the harbor, the crash of the waves following you like footsteps. You leave the salt-heavy air of the coast behind, trading the taste of brine for the dust of old roads. Inland, the land rises gently, then sharply, into hills dotted with olive groves whose twisted trunks look as though they have been arguing with the wind for centuries. Above them, perched on the ridges like watchful vultures, are the monasteries, stone-walled, window-slit, and built as much for defense as devotion. It is here, in the quiet halls of the cloister, that kingdoms can be made or unmade without a single sword drawn. The church in Castile and Aragon is no passive shepherd. It is a calculating power, with abbots and bishops whose fingers are just as accustomed to turning the pages of scripture as they are to sliding rings across maps. In Burgos, the cathedral rises like a frozen hymn, its spires carved with such care you might imagine the stone would sing if the wind struck it right. Inside, the floor is cool underfoot, and the smell of incense clings to every carved pew. You watch as priests in scarlet-trimmed robes confer in the shadows, their whispers drowned beneath the echo of the choir. Their faces betray little, but you sense the undercurrent. Alliances, debts, and favors owed, all hidden beneath the surface of liturgy. In Zaragoza, the monasteries are less ornate but no less powerful. Here, the monks are scholars, scribes, and keepers of secrets. In candlelit rooms, they copy manuscripts, some holy, others less so, while keeping one ear on the shifting winds of royal policy. A single letter from an influential abbot can tilt a succession dispute or call for the excommunication of a noble who has grown too bold. The church's reach stretches into the smallest villages, where even the poorest peasants kneel before the altar. But the real weight is felt in the royal courts, where bishops dine beside kings and abbots are consulted before generals. In a land where crowns are always one bad harvest or one ambitious cousin away from crisis, the blessing or curse of the church is as decisive as an army. Yet the church's loyalty is not given lightly. Castile and Aragon both seek to bind it to their cause, offering land, privileges, or the patronage of grand building projects. In return, the church demands influence, a say in taxation, control over certain laws, the right to judge disputes that skirt the edges of both faith and politics. It is a constant negotiation, played in private chambers with eyes that never quite meet. And sometimes the most dangerous battles are fought between holy men themselves. A bishop of Aragon may accuse his Castilian counterpart of heresy, knowing the charge will stain not just the man, but the king he favors. A monk in Burgos might discover a text in the archives that could question a royal claim, only to find himself transferred to some distant mountain abbey before he can share it. In this world of cloisters and cathedrals, faith is not a shield. It is a blade, drawn and sheathed with care. And you cannot help but wonder if, in the silent hours of the night, The kings of Castile and Aragon sleep more uneasily, knowing their thrones rest not just on armies, but on the shifting grace of the church. The road draws you out of the shadow of the monasteries and into a different kind of cathedral, one made not of stone and stained glass, but of timber stalls, flapping awnings, and the constant, restless hum of human commerce. You step into the merchant quarter of Toledo, and it feels as though the world has decided to gather here. Spices from the Levant perfume the air, sharp cinnamon, warm cumin, a hint of clove that makes you think of autumn feasts. Traders from Genoa and Pisa bark in quick, overlapping bursts of Italian, haggling with locals whose Castilian is laced with the sharper consonants of Arabic. The clink of scales weighing silver competes with the braying of mules, and somewhere a blind musician plucks a lute with such melancholy precision that it almost makes you forget the stink of fish left too long in the sun. In the great trading halls, the real deals are made far from the noise of the street. Here, merchants in fine wool and velvet lean across polished tables, their fingers resting casually on account books as they talk about grain shipments, silk caravans, and the price of salt. Always salt, for without it, armies cannot march, meat cannot keep, and fortunes turn to dust. A man with a gold chain around his neck murmurs about lending money to the crown, at interest naturally, and his listener, a royal agent, nods as if the arrangement were as sacred as a marriage. Castile thrives on wool, the endless flocks of the meseta feeding the looms of Flanders and England. Aragon, with its Mediterranean ports, commands the flow of silk, spices, and exotic goods that ride the waves from Alexandria and Constantinople. Both kingdoms know that in the counting rooms of their merchants lies a second kind of army, one that fights with credit, ships, and contracts instead of spears. But wealth breeds rivalry as much as it breeds opportunity. Castilian envoys in Barcelona keep an eye on Aragonese trade treaties with the Italian states, while Aragonese officials in Seville quietly calculate just how much tax Castile truly collects on wool exports. The merchants themselves are loyal only to profit, willing to sell to friend or foe as long as the coin is pure and the risk manageable. In the taverns where deals are sealed over jugs of wine, you hear the sharper edge of this competition. A trader from Valencia boasts of a shipment of silk bound for Bruges that will undercut Castilian cloth by half. A wool merchant from Burgos counters with news of a new route that avoids Aragonese tolls entirely. The laughter is loud, but the undertone is clear. Every crown earned here is a stone laid in the foundation of one throne, or the weakening of another. And in the corners, where the light is dim and the tables sticky with old wine, there are men who profit from more than goods. They trade in whispers. Which ship left port at night with a suspicious cargo? Which caravan carried letters sealed with a royal crest not meant for foreign eyes? Information, after all, can buy more than gold, it can buy control. The marketplace is a battlefield without banners, and in it, Castile and Aragon fight their quietest, yet most decisive war. If the merchant quarter is a battlefield without banners, the noble courts are a battlefield without blood. At least not the kind that stains the floor immediately. You find yourself in the great hall of a Castilian palace, where sunlight filters through narrow windows to glint on silver goblets and the polished hilts of ceremonial swords. Here, power is traded in glances, gestures, and the careful choice of words that can be a promise or a threat, depending on the ear that hears them. Marriage is the sharpest weapon in this world, sharper than any Toledo blade. A wedding between a Castilian infanta and an Aragonese prince can bind two realms in a fragile peace, but it can just as easily plant the seeds of future war. Each union is a treaty written in flesh and blood, and each child born is a pawn or a king in the making. You watch a young noblewoman glide past, her gown a cascade of crimson silk, her face serene. She has been promised to a man she has met only once, a marriage designed not for love but for the securing of trade rights to a cluster of coastal towns. Her family smiles at the match, for it strengthens their hold over a stretch of land that both crowns covet. She, meanwhile, keeps her thoughts behind eyes that give nothing away. The royal courts of Castile and Aragon are mirrors that distort. In one, knights and grandees debate questions of honor, fealty, and the Reconquista's relentless push southward. In the other, counselors speak of maritime dominance, of treaties with Genoa, and of how to keep Sicily in line. But in both, the undercurrent is the same. Who marries whom, who inherits what, and who will stand beside the throne when the king finally breathes his last. Family alliances are tangled things. A cousin in Aragon might also be a rival claimant to a Castilian estate. A niece in Castile might find herself a hostage in all but name, married into a family whose loyalty to the crown is thin at best. Every celebration hides an element of calculation. Every feast is also a council. The halls are loud with music and laughter, but behind the doors of private chambers, the talk turns colder. Letters arrive from far-off relatives, each carrying subtle reminders of debts owed, favors granted, and promises yet to be fulfilled. Some arrive with gifts, a bolt of rare cloth, a casket of spiced wine, but the true currency is obligation. Even the clergy take part. Bishops and abbots, often drawn from noble families, whisper counsel into royal ears. A papal dispensation here, an annulment there, such tools can dissolve alliances as neatly as they create them. It is in these courts, far from the clang of armor or the noise of the market, that the borders of Castile and Aragon shift most dangerously. Wars may begin on the battlefield, but they are planned here, over the flicker of candles and the quiet scratch of quills. If the courts are the stage, then the shadow world beneath them is the script no one admits exists. In the narrow alleys behind the palaces of Castile and Aragon, where the smell of fish from the market blends with the tang of horse sweat, another kind of diplomacy is practiced. One that deals in whispers, stolen letters, and gold that changes hands under the cover of night. Spies move between the kingdoms like ghosts in broad daylight. Some are professional informants, trained to slip into a crowd and disappear again, carrying secrets tucked in their memories or written in codes so obscure that only a handful of people alive can read them. Others are amateurs, drawn into the trade by greed, desperation, or the simple fact that they overheard something they should not have. The merchants are perhaps the most dangerous of them all. A man who sells wool in Seville one week and olive oil in Valencia the next can carry more than goods in his wagons. He can carry maps, troop counts, or lists of names, information worth more than any cargo. Their ledgers often hold a second set of accounts, detailing not trade profits, but payments from shadowy patrons. Courtiers, too, are not immune. A maid who serves wine at the king's table may carry gossip to a rival court. A scribe might copy a treaty for his sovereign and a duplicate for another master entirely. In the rarest cases, knights themselves are turned, convinced by promises of land or titles, or broken by debts they cannot repay. Aragonese spies are said to favor subtlety, intercepted letters, altered messages, the quiet turning of allies into double agents. Castilian agents, on the other hand, are rumored to prefer bold strokes. Bribery, blackmail, and sudden exposure of a rival's secrets at precisely the wrong moment. And then there are the intermediaries, those whose loyalty is not to a crown, but to the highest bidder. They are the ones who broker deals between betrayer and betrayed, arranging secret meetings in candlelit rooms above taverns where the laughter below masks the gravity of the conversations above. The church again proves itself a player in every realm. Confessionals are sacred, but ears are still ears. A priest might never repeat a penitent's sins, but he might advise the right person at the right time, hinting at the shape of events without ever naming them. The irony is that everyone in these kingdoms knows spies exist, and most could name at least two who operate openly under some convenient pretext. Yet no one dares confront the system, because to dismantle it would be to strip oneself of the very tools needed to survive in the endless rivalry. Here, truth is currency, and the value of a secret rises and falls faster than the price of grain. In this world of half-lit rooms and unmarked doors, loyalty is a matter of contract, not conviction. You may serve your king in the morning and sell him in the evening, so long as the price is right and your conscience can sleep. If the courts and the shadows between them are the brain and the nerves of Iberian politics, then the Mediterranean is the bloodstream, pumping wealth, ambition, and temptation into every corner of Castile and Aragon. Trade routes, as much as armies or marriages, decide who prospers and who is left to wither. From the ports of Barcelona and Valencia, Aragon's ships cut sleek lines across the water, their hulls swollen with goods. Silks from Genoa, spices from Alexandria, gold from the Maghreb. Every arrival brought not just exotic wares, but exotic ideas, new ways to wage war, new tools for diplomacy, and, sometimes, new diseases to remind everyone that the sea gives and the sea takes. Castile, lacking such a long Mediterranean coast, played a different game. Its wealth came overland, through caravans that snaked across the interior, bringing wool from the Meseta and silver from its mines. Yet even Castile had its hungry eyes on the sea, for a merchant with a direct route to the east could rival a king in influence. The rivalry often took the form of tariffs, embargoes, and quietly encouraged piracy. A merchant flying Aragonese colors might find himself boarded in the Straits of Gibraltar by a Castilian ship that just happened to be patrolling that day. Likewise, Castile's caravans could be harassed by bandits in regions where Aragon's influence ran deep, bandits who somehow always knew exactly which wagons carried the richest goods. The ports themselves were microcosms of the kingdom's ambitions. In Valencia, you might see a Moorish navigator bargaining with a Christian captain over a cargo of saffron, while 2 stalls away, a Jewish financier scribbled numbers into a ledger that would decide the fate of the voyage. Deals were struck in a blend of Catalan, Castilian, Arabic, and Italian, each word another layer in the web of alliances and betrayals. Naval technology became both a weapon and a bargaining chip. Aragon's shipbuilders experimented with faster hull designs to outrun pirates, or to become better pirates themselves. Castile, slower to adopt maritime innovations, sought instead to hire foreign experts, importing not just shipwrights but entire fleets from allies in Italy or France. But the true power of these routes lay not in the goods, but in the control of information. A letter could travel from Constantinople to Barcelona in less than a month if the winds favored it, carrying news of a war, a plague, or a political shift that could upend the careful balance in Iberia. Whoever controlled the flow of such news could decide how and when it reached the ears of their rivals. Thus, the Mediterranean became both highway and battlefield, lined not with fortresses of stone, but with ships bristling with sails and silent intentions. To own the sea was to own the future, and both kingdoms knew it. Yet neither could claim it entirely, for the sea belongs to those with the courage or recklessness to ride its shifting moods. If merchants carried goods and sailors carried rumors, it was the chroniclers who decided which would outlive the century. In Iberia, history was not merely recorded. It was manufactured, polished, and sharpened into a weapon as deadly as any sword. Every court had its official storytellers, though they called themselves historiadors, chronistas, or, in the most flattering cases, keepers of the realm's memory. Their task was to craft the kingdom's past in such a way that it justified the present. In Aragon, a victory at sea might be retold as proof of divine favor, with the enemy described as arrogant, godless, and deserving of ruin. In Castile, the same battle might be reframed as a tragic setback, the fault of treachery or the cowardice of a single commander, never the fault of the king. These chroniclers were not cloistered scribes working in dusty silence. They moved between the banquets and the council chambers, listening as much to the whispers of power as to the speeches of kings. Some were rewarded with gold for their loyalty. Others were rewarded with survival for their discretion. The manipulation of history could be subtle. Even the very language of the record was a tool. In Castile, events were often described in grand biblical tones, casting the monarch as a kind of chosen shepherd of the people. In Aragon, the language leaned toward chivalric ideals, presenting the king as a knight among knights, surrounded by a fellowship bound by honor. Both styles were propaganda, wrapped in the appearance of solemn truth. The audience for these crafted histories was not only the nobility. Read aloud in town squares or monasteries, they shaped the beliefs of merchants, peasants, and priests alike. A fisherman in Valencia might believe his king was destined to unite all Christendom against the Moors, while a shepherd in Burgos might be certain that his own monarch was the one chosen by heaven for that same task. Sometimes, these dueling narratives collided spectacularly. A treaty could be signed in reality but recorded so differently in each kingdom's chronicles that future generations would argue whether it had been a truce, a victory, or an act of surrender. The ink was dry, but the truth remained fluid. And so, in a land of swords and sieges, it was the quill that often struck the deepest blow. For while a castle might fall in a night, a well-crafted chronicle could shape the memory of that fall for centuries. And in Iberia, memory was often the sharpest edge of all. Religion in medieval Iberia was never just about the soul. It was about borders, banners, and the theater of power. The churches, monasteries, and cathedrals of Castile and Aragon did not merely serve as places of worship. They were stages upon which kings performed legitimacy. On feast days, the streets became rivers of processions, candles flickering against gilded reliquaries, incense curling through the air like phantom banners. But these were not purely acts of devotion. In Castile, the king might walk barefoot to a cathedral door, his head bowed, the image of humility carefully rehearsed for the eyes of the people. In Aragon, the monarch might instead ride beneath a canopy of silk, a living emblem of divine favor, scattering coins to the poor as if he were dispensing blessings himself. Clergy, too, were political actors. Bishops could crown kings, excommunicate rivals, or bless armies before they marched. They were as essential to the machinery of rule as any general or treasurer. Castilian rulers often sought papal bulls to sanctify their wars, transforming a territorial conflict into a holy cause. Aragonese kings, meanwhile, cultivated alliances with monastic orders like the Cistercians and the Knights Hospitaller, securing both moral endorsement and trained, battle-ready men. Relics, those fragments of saints' bones, splinters of the true cross, or shreds of holy garments, were another weapon in the arsenal of legitimacy. Castile displayed theirs in grand cathedrals like Toledo, attracting pilgrims from across Christendom. Aragon's rulers, never to be outdone, competed for equally sacred treasures, sometimes purchasing them at ruinous cost, other times acquiring them through more creative means during campaigns. A relic could make a city a destination, a bishopric wealthy, and a king appear favored by heaven. Yet this sacred stage could also become a battlefield. Disputes over ecclesiastical jurisdiction might escalate into diplomatic standoffs. A papal envoy could be wined, dined, and bribed in one court, only to be warned, threatened, or detained in another. Both kingdoms mastered the art of wrapping political ambition in liturgical robes. For the people, the spectacle was convincing. The ringing of cathedral bells, the solemn Latin chants, the sight of their ruler kneeling before the altar. These were powerful images in a world where divine will and earthly power were believed to be inseparable. But behind the pious pageantry, every sermon and every procession was calculated. Faith was genuine, yes, but it was also deeply, inextricably entangled with the pursuit of thrones. In Iberia, a king's sword might win him a battle, but it was the blessing of the church that could win him history's memory and ensure that his rival's crown looked just a little less secure. If wars were fought in the open, diplomacy in medieval Iberia was waged in the shadows. Castile and Aragon, though bound at times by marriage, treaty, or common enemy, never ceased to probe each other's weaknesses through messengers, marriage contracts, and the occasional whisper in a candlelit corner. The royal court was a hive of listening ears. Ambassadors were not mere envoys, they were collectors of secrets. A Castilian sent to Aragon might deliver a letter from the king in the morning and, by nightfall, be slipping coins to a chamberlain for gossip about military supply routes. An Aragonese diplomat in Toledo could just as easily be found in the chapel at dawn, praying conspicuously for peace, before meeting a disgruntled noble who had been overlooked for promotion. Spies, too, were part of the fabric of this political chessboard. Some were professionals, men who could cross borders under the guise of merchants or pilgrims. Others were opportunists. A minor scribe willing to leak a document for the promise of a future post, or a falconer whose birds conveniently carried not just messages for hunting, but coded instructions on military maneuvers. In ports like Valencia and Seville, foreign traders doubled as informants, passing word of ship movements or grain shortages to the highest bidder. Marriages were perhaps the most subtle weapons of all. A union between a Castilian princess and an Aragonese prince could be a handshake across centuries of rivalry, or a Trojan horse. With every bride came a dowry, a household of attendants, and a line of communication into the heart of the rival court. Some queens wrote letters back to their birth families in invisible ink, their messages hidden between the lines of prayers. Others became advocates for their adopted realms, genuinely shifting the balance of alliance. And yet, in this world of veiled intentions, nothing was permanent. A sworn ally in spring could be an enemy by harvest, treaties torn apart as swiftly as they were signed. To survive, rulers and their agents had to master the art of ambiguity, speaking words that could be interpreted 3 different ways, keeping a dagger sheathed until the precise moment it would matter most. In the taverns and markets, ordinary people told stories of royal spies as if they were ghost tales, of couriers who vanished on the road between Zaragoza and Burgos, of letters found hidden inside hollowed loaves of bread. Whether true or not, such tales served as a reminder. In Iberia, the greatest battles were often fought with ink and whispers, not swords and blood. The game was relentless, its players ever-changing, but its prize remained constant. Control over a land where the lines between friend and foe, truth and lie, faith and strategy were never entirely clear. If swords and spies shaped the power of Castile and Aragon, it was gold, both the kind mined from the earth and the kind minted in their mints, that kept that power alive. In medieval Iberia, wealth was not a luxury. It was the lifeblood of armies, the lure for alliances, and the deciding factor in whether a king could enforce his will beyond the walls of his own palace. Castile, with its vast interior plains, relied heavily on sheep. Not just any sheep, but the prized merino, whose fine wool was sought in markets as far away as Flanders and Italy. The wool trade became Castile's golden artery, feeding coins into the royal treasury through taxes on merchants, tolls at bridges, and levies on exported bales. Seasonal migrations of flocks, the great transhumants, were so vital that entire laws were written to protect their routes. The Canada's reels, from farmers and ambitious lords who might fence them off. A Castilian king might lose a battle and still recover, but a disruption in the wool trade could cripple him for years. Aragon's strength, on the other hand, came from the sea. Its ports, Barcelona, Valencia, Palma, were bustling entrepôts for goods flowing in from the Mediterranean and beyond. Spices from the Levant, silks from the east, wine and oil from the fertile coastal plains, all passed through Aragonese docks. The crown of Aragon, with its far-flung holdings in Sardinia, Sicily, and Naples, was as much a maritime empire as a land-based one. Taxes on harbor traffic and trade licenses were jealously guarded sources of income, and piracy, whether condemned or quietly encouraged, was simply another tool of competition. Both kingdoms squeezed revenue from their subjects with a thoroughness that would make a modern tax inspector nod in admiration. Peasants paid in grain, towns in coin, and nobles in loyalty backed by military service. Special taxes, called servicios in Castile and generalitats in Aragon, were levied to fund wars, often with promises they would be temporary, promises rarely kept. The Jewish communities, though periodically persecuted, were also valued for their role in lending money to the crown when wars drained the treasury faster than taxes could replenish it. Trade between the two kingdoms was a paradox, mutually beneficial yet politically fraught. Castilian wool might pass through Aragonese ports, and Aragonese olive oil might find buyers in Castile's inland markets. But every coin exchanged was a reminder of economic interdependence. Each kingdom feared that the other's prosperity might tip the balance of power. In the counting houses of Burgos and the dockside warehouses of Barcelona, the fate of Iberia was being shaped as much as in any battlefield. Kings could not march without coin, fleets could not sail without timber and tar, and alliances could not be bought without gold. And so, the economic rivalry simmered beneath every treaty, every marriage alliance, and every whispered accusation of unfair tariffs or smuggling. It was said, half in jest, that a Castilian king feared two things above all: losing his sheep and losing his bankers. An Aragonese king, meanwhile, feared an empty harbor more than an enemy army. In the end, war might decide borders, but coin decided who could afford to claim them. If wool and wine filled the coffers of Castile and Aragon, it was the church that filled their thrones with legitimacy, or, when offended, pulled the floor out from under them. In medieval Iberia, religion was not a private matter. It was the scaffolding on which kingdoms were built, the invisible thread binding subjects to sovereigns. A king might lose a fortress and survive, but lose the blessing of the church, and his reign would rot from within. Castile's monarchs styled themselves as champions of the faith, heirs to a divine mission that stretched back to the early Reconquista. The title Rey Católico had not yet been formally bestowed, but the idea was already present. To rule was to fight for Christianity. Every campaign against the Muslim kingdoms to the south was framed as holy work, not mere politics. This sacred branding served a practical purpose. It made taxation for war a matter of piety, and dissent against the king dangerously close to dissent against God. Aragon, with its maritime reach and Mediterranean ambitions, played a subtler game. Its rulers also waged holy war when opportunity arose, but they were equally invested in cultivating papal favor for overseas ventures. A papal bull could justify the seizure of a rival's island as easily as it could sanction a crusade in North Africa. The crown of Aragon's diplomats in Rome were as crucial as its admirals in the Tyrrhenian Sea. Both kingdoms relied on bishops as royal agents. Cathedrals doubled as centers of administration, their clerics literate, trained, and often more loyal to the king than to their diocese. Monasteries, too, served as both spiritual sanctuaries and economic engines, managing vast estates and channeling wealth into royal projects. Yet the relationship was never entirely smooth. The church had its own power, its own courts, and, in theory, the ability to excommunicate a king. Even the most devout monarchs learned to tread carefully around Rome's sensibilities. Religion also shaped diplomacy between Castile and Aragon. Marriage alliances were blessed or blocked by the church. Disputes over episcopal appointments could spiral into political crises. And then there was the thorny question of religious minorities. Jews and Muslims lived in both kingdoms, often in thriving communities that contributed to trade, finance, and craftsmanship. The church's stance toward these groups shifted between reluctant tolerance and outright hostility, depending on the century, the pope, and the mood of the street. Kings walked a tightrope, protecting their economic utility while avoiding accusations of impiety. In times of tension between the two crowns, both could weaponize religion. Castile might accuse Aragon of laxity toward heretics. Aragon might hint that Castile's aggressive expansion was more greed than godliness. Papal envoys, enjoying the role of kingmakers, often fanned the flames before offering themselves as mediators. And so, beneath the gilded crucifixes and solemn processions, religion in medieval Iberia was as much about power as salvation. The altar and the throne were joined, each lending the other weight. To defy one was to risk the wrath of both, and in that dangerous fusion lay one of the most enduring truths of Iberian politics. In Castile and Aragon, the cross was not only a symbol of faith, it was a weapon. If religion gave Castile and Aragon the moral scaffolding of kingship, marriage gave them the scaffolding of dynastic ambition. A royal wedding in medieval Iberia was never merely a union of two people. It was a treaty, a gamble, and sometimes a calculated trap wrapped in lace and Latin vows. The Iberian Peninsula was a chessboard, and its monarchs thought several moves ahead. A king's marriage could seal peace with a rival, secure an ally against a common enemy, or give a legal claim to a neighbor's throne. The trouble was, the same marriage could just as easily sow the seeds of war, especially when heirs were involved. Castile, with its vast interior and agricultural wealth, often sought brides from beyond Iberia. Portuguese princesses to secure its western flank, English or French noblewomen to bind it into continental politics. These unions brought prestige and occasionally dowries large enough to finance campaigns. But marrying outside the peninsula risked bringing in foreign influence that local nobles did not always welcome. Aragon's marital diplomacy had a distinctly Mediterranean flavor. Its kings eyed Sicily, Naples, and even the eastern Mediterranean, where marriage to the right heiress could open harbors and trade routes. The Aragonese crown was adept at mixing marital alliances with military conquest. Capture an island, marry its heiress, and legitimize the conquest in one move. Between Castile and Aragon themselves, marriage was both a bridge and a barrier. The idea of uniting the two crowns through a dynastic match had been floated many times before it finally happened in the late 15th century. But earlier attempts were often sabotaged by shifting alliances, premature deaths, or the ever-watchful church, which required papal dispensations for unions between cousins, a common complication when most Iberian royalty already shared bloodlines. The human side of these marriages was often tragic. Princesses sent to foreign courts might find themselves in lands where their language was not spoken, their customs ignored, and their value reduced to the ability to produce an heir. Queens in both Castile and Aragon wielded influence at court, but their power was tethered to their fertility and their ability to maintain political favor. The death of a queen could dissolve a fragile peace. The birth of a son could transform a tentative alliance into something enduring. Sometimes marriage served as a Trojan horse. A dowry might include disputed territory, creating decades of legal wrangling. A princess might bring with her advisors loyal to her homeland, subtly shifting a king's policies. And should the marriage sour, accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or heresy were convenient tools for annulment. It was in these matrimonial negotiations that the crowns of Castile and Aragon learned both the allure and the danger of union. The thought of a single dynasty ruling from the Pyrenees to the Strait of Gibraltar was tempting, but for much of the Middle Ages, neither kingdom was willing to submit to the other's dominance. The marriage that would one day unite them was still far in the future, but the pattern of careful calculation, rivalry, and occasional cooperation was already well established. If dynastic marriages were the threads weaving Castile and Aragon together, or pulling them apart, foreign powers were the restless fingers tugging at that fabric. In the medieval world, Iberia was not a secluded corner of Europe but a contested prize. an arena where France, England, and the papacy played their own long games. France loomed as both a threat and a tempting ally. For Aragon, with its foothold in the Mediterranean and proximity to the Pyrenees, French politics were impossible to ignore. French kings claimed influence over Catalonia in earlier centuries, and French nobles, especially those from Languedoc, were frequent participants in Iberian wars. At times, Aragon sought to appease France through treaties and marriages. At others, it resisted French interference with military campaigns and maritime alliances. England, though geographically distant, found ways to meddle. Its rivalry with France in the Hundred Years' War spilled into Iberia as both sides sought allies. Castile's powerful navy became a sought-after asset, sometimes sailing alongside French fleets against the English, and at other times courting English favor when it served their ambitions. This tug-of-war meant that Castile's alignment could shift rapidly depending on who offered the better trade terms or the most advantageous marriage. The papacy was the most subtle and perhaps the most dangerous player. No king could afford to ignore Rome, for the Pope's blessing legitimized crowns, marriages, and treaties. Yet papal authority could also be a weapon. A pope might excommunicate a monarch for defying church policy, deny a requested marriage dispensation to block a political union, or call for crusades in Iberia that diverted resources and shifted alliances. In many ways, Rome was both referee and participant in the game, pretending to arbitrate while quietly advancing its own agenda. Even the Italian city-states, Genoa, Venice, and Pisa, left fingerprints on Iberian politics. They financed naval expeditions, sold weapons, and competed for trade rights in ports from Valencia to Seville. Aragon, with its Mediterranean reach, often found itself entangled in their rivalries, while Castile's Atlantic coast drew merchants from farther north. Foreign meddling had a curious effect. It sometimes forced Castile and Aragon into temporary cooperation. A French-backed rebellion in one kingdom might prompt the other to offer aid, if only to prevent France from gaining too strong a foothold. Similarly, papal pressure could drive both crowns to present a united Catholic front, at least until the immediate crisis passed. In this tangled web of diplomacy, espionage, and opportunism, Iberia was less a backwater and more a crossroads of European ambition. Castile and Aragon might have been rivals at home, but abroad, they were fellow players in a dangerous continental game. And while the crowns could not yet imagine a lasting political union, they were learning an important truth. Survival in the European arena sometimes required the appearance of brotherhood, even if the embrace concealed a dagger. Inside the walls of Castilian and Aragonese courts, the gravest obstacles to unity were not always foreign armies or rival monarchs, but the restless ambitions of their own nobility. If kings were the architects of policy, the great lords were the masons, and sometimes the wrecking crew. In Castile, the grandees were vast landowners whose estates sprawled across provinces like miniature kingdoms. They could raise armies, levy rents, and enforce justice almost as if the crown were a polite suggestion rather than an authority. Monarchs who tried to rein them in often found themselves in a dangerous game of chess where each piece had its own agenda. One ill-judged tax, one slight to a noble house, and the king could face open rebellion. This is why Castilian kings so often relied on towns and cities, those bustling centers of merchants and craftsmen, to counterbalance noble power. Town militias might not match a noble's cavalry in grandeur, but they were fiercely loyal when their privileges were protected. Aragon's situation was even more intricate. Its crown governed a confederation, Aragon proper, Catalonia, Valencia, each with its own laws and fiercely guarded rights. The Aragonese Cortes, Catalan courts, and Valencian courts were not mere advisory bodies. They were legislative institutions with the authority to block royal decrees. Kings in Aragon ruled by negotiation, and a heavy-handed approach could paralyze governance. It was a land where monarchs had to be diplomats at home before they could be conquerors abroad. The tension between crown and nobility meant that both Castile and Aragon developed a political culture of bargaining. Royal power was rarely absolute. It was a candle that flickered in the draft of competing interests. Even moments of apparent unity often masked compromises. A marriage alliance that guaranteed noble privileges, a military campaign financed by urban taxes in exchange for trade exemptions, a legal reform that looked bold but left the feudal order intact. This internal balancing act had a critical side effect. It made sudden, sweeping changes almost impossible. A formal union between Castile and Aragon would not only require the consent of two monarchs, it would demand the cooperation of dozens of magnates, the acquiescence of urban elites, and the careful navigation of centuries-old legal traditions. Any hint that unity might erode local privileges would summon opposition from every quarter. And yet, in the long view, these very tensions were preparing the ground for the eventual union. By constantly negotiating with their own power bases, the crowns of Castile and Aragon learned patience, political dexterity, and the art of compromise, skills they would need when trying to stitch together an Iberia that had never before been truly won. It was a lesson written not in treaties or proclamations, but in the daily dance between monarch and subject, that ruling was less about commanding than persuading, and that sometimes the most powerful move on the chessboard was to keep the game going until the board itself could be remade. By the late 15th century, Iberia was a map in motion. Borders shifted like the tide, armies marched, treaties were inked and torn apart within a season. Yet if you looked closely, you could see something subtler at work. A slow knitting together of Castile and Aragon, not through grand declarations, but through 1,000 quiet threads. Trade was one such thread. Merchants from Barcelona began to see the profit in sending their ships not only east to the Mediterranean but westward towards Seville's ports, where goods from Castile's interior could be loaded for the Atlantic. Guild charters in Valencia included clauses to welcome Castilian traders. Even in Toledo's bustling markets, you could hear a growing blend of accents. Aragonese alongside Castilian, Catalan phrases mingling with Andalusian slang. There were also the marriages, small ones, not the famous royal match to come. Noble houses sought to cement alliances across the two crowns, weaving personal loyalty into political interest. A lord from Zaragoza might marry his daughter into a Castilian family with lands in La Mancha, creating a network of mutual obligations that made war between the kingdoms increasingly inconvenient. And then there was the Reconquista, still unfinished but nearing its climax. Both Castile and Aragon were invested in the final push against Granada. Though their campaigns were technically separate, there was a growing sense that the Muslim-ruled emirate was a common enemy whose fall would mark the culmination of a centuries-long struggle. Joint military ventures were rare, but not unheard of, and each one built a fragile trust between their armies. Yet beneath this growing web of shared interest, there remained fragility. Every step toward cooperation risked backlash. In Barcelona, merchants complained that Castilian grain imports undercut local prices. In Burgos, guild leaders grumbled that Aragonese textiles competed unfairly. Even the nobility, so skilled at turning politics to their advantage, feared that a closer union might upset the delicate balance of privilege they had fought to maintain for generations. It was in this tense atmosphere, part hope, part suspicion, that a single marriage would alter the fate of the peninsula. When Princess Isabella of Castile and Prince Ferdinand of Aragon pledged themselves to each other in 1469, it was not yet the act that would unite their crowns. It was, rather, a gamble that love, politics, and timing might accomplish what centuries of conquest and negotiation had failed to achieve. The bet was risky, the stakes nothing less than the future of Iberia. But for the first time in generations, the dream of a united Spain seemed less like a poet's fantasy and more like a possibility, if only the fragile peace could hold long enough for the gamble to pay off. The wedding of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon in Valladolid in 1469 was not, as later portraits would suggest, a moment of serene inevitability. There were no celestial trumpets heralding the dawn of a united Spain, no grand proclamation declaring the end of centuries of rival crowns. It was, in truth, a political calculation disguised as romance, and a romance cautiously wrapped in political calculation. They were young, Isabella just 18, Ferdinand 17, but both were already seasoned in the art of survival. Isabella had navigated Castile's brutal court politics, resisting both the marriage plans of her half-brother King Henry IV and the ambitions of foreign suitors. Ferdinand, the heir to Aragon, had been groomed in the craft of statecraft by his father, King John II, who understood that alliances forged in marriage could outlast victories won on the battlefield. Their union was daring in its defiance of power. It had been arranged in secret, carried out under the threat of Henry IV's wrath, and legitimized only after hasty papal approval. Approval secured, if we're being blunt, through some rather creative paperwork. Yet it worked. Not overnight, not cleanly, but over years of shared campaigns, shrewd reforms, and an almost theatrical public image as the Catholic monarchs. Isabella and Ferdinand turned two crowns into a partnership that was neither fully merged nor entirely separate. The fruits of that partnership were swift and dramatic. Together, they completed the Reconquista in 1492, ending Muslim rule in Granada after 7 centuries. In the same year, they authorized a Genoese navigator named Cristobal Colon to sail west, setting in motion an age of exploration and conquest that would stretch their influence far beyond Iberia. They reformed the administration of justice, centralized taxation, and harnessed the power of the church to bolster their legitimacy. And yet, beneath the triumphs, the union remained a delicate fiction. Castile and Aragon retained their own laws, their own parliaments, their own systems of taxation. Isabella ruled Castile, Ferdinand ruled Aragon. Their authority overlapped not in the creation of a single Spain, but in the shared determination to present themselves to the world as if such a Spain already existed. When Isabella died in 1504, the illusion was tested. Without her, the balance tipped, and Ferdinand found himself scrambling to maintain influence in Castile against rival claimants and foreign interference. The crowns would pass to their daughter Joanna, known to history as the Mad, and her Habsburg husband Philip, drawing Iberia into a web of European dynastic politics. Still, the legacy of Isabella and Ferdinand endured. They had not erased the boundaries between their kingdoms, but they had sketched, for the first time, a convincing outline of what a united Spain could be. Theirs was a story of calculated risks, improbable victories, and a vision that outlived them, even if it was never as seamless as the legends claimed. And so the lost thrones of Iberia were not truly lost. They were transformed, their crowns worn by rulers who understood that the greatest conquests are often not of land, but of the imagination.